Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. As we have people file in, just wanted to welcome you. So we'll just give it another moment or two for everyone to get settled. My name is Brooke Wages. I am a student at the Kennedy School. Awesome. Great. Okay, hello everyone. It is such a pleasure to be with you today. As I mentioned before, my name is Brooke Wages. I am a dual degree student at Harvard Kennedy School and MIT Sloan School of Management. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to an HKS Anti-Racism Policy Journal event, Necessary Trouble, a conversation about the life and legacy of Congressman John Lewis and the future of anti-racism work in America. I am going to launch us off and introduce our distinguished moderator and professor we all know and love here at the Kennedy School. Cornell William Brooks is a Hauser professor of the practice of nonprofit organizations and professor of the practice of public leadership and social justice at Harvard Kennedy School. He is also the director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice and Social Justice at the School of the Center for Public Leadership, and visiting professor of the practice of prophetic religion and public leadership at Harvard Divinity School. Brooks is the former president and CEO of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, and a civil rights attorney that studied at Yale Law School, and an ordained minister in the AME tradition. As I turn it over to him, I just want to say how deeply blessed I have been to be a student of his. We have a lot of intellect and knowledge, which he has in great numbers and great amounts, but the amount of patience and empathy is something that is in such short supply in Cambridge. So I just want to also say that how great it is to be in his presence, and am looking forward to him moderating this fantastic discussion.
So, first of all, let me just begin with a word of appreciation for that warm introduction, and to note that we are in for a wonderful and powerful panel discussion on this, the 35th anniversary of the election of John Lewis to Congress. Many of us here at Harvard recall only a few years ago when Congressman Lewis was awarded an honorary doctorate. I recall only a few years before then, standing with John Lewis and Amelia Boynton and President Barack Obama on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma as we commemorated the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. But that commemoration was also a commemoration of the courage, the resilience, the deep moral convictions of John Lewis. And it was my good fortune to literally stand right behind him and literally walk in his steps. There's so many students, so many activists, so many advocates, certainly the people on this panel who are in this moment, in the midst of this trying hour of our democracy, who are literally walking in the legacy, the words and work of John Lewis. So I know that you, like I, am extraordinarily happy to be in the midst of so many great people on this panel who knew John Lewis well. And so it is my honor to simply introduce them. Now, in order to maximize the time for conversation, I have to provide these brutally brief bios of our guests. But I want you to know that these are the people who walk the talk in art, in law, in policy, in advocacy. And so you are in good hands. So first, I want to introduce Michael Collins, who is a currently a special assistant to President, I believe, Vice President Kamala Harris, right? Special assistant to Vice President, the former chief of staff to John Lewis. He served him for over 20 years. He's a longtime political staffer with extensive experience in legislative affairs, operations, and stakeholder engagement. He served for more than 20 years as chief of staff and floor assistant to former Congressman John Lewis. He helped the congressman and stood with him in terms of the development of excellent constituent service and thoughtful public policy. Throughout his tenure, he directed the work of the congressional staff, both in Washington and the district staff in Atlanta. He has a background, obviously, in federal public service in terms of the federal government. He's a native of Boston, holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Morehouse College. And for my colleagues at Harvard who may be familiar with Oxford and Stanford, I want you all to take note of that degree from Morehouse College. There is a tremendous legacy there, as well as an MSW from Boston College, an MBA from Emory, and he resides in Washington, D.C. Next on your screen is Dawn Porter. And if you have not seen her work, you have literally robbed yourself of an experience. She's an award-winning filmmaker, producer, mental health and social justice advocate. She has emerged in the entertainment industry as a leader in the art of storytelling, directing, producing critically acclaimed projects, including Good Trouble, featuring and focusing on John Lewis. She also produced the Me You Can't See for Apple Television, focusing on mental health, which was executive produced by Oprah Winfrey and Prince Harry. She produced Rise Again, Tulsa in the Red Summer for National Geographic, an important chapter in our nation's history. I want to note here that she produced the documentary The Spies of Mississippi concerning the Sovereignty Commission in Mississippi, which surveilled. It was like a domestic state level FBI COINTEL program, truly a draconian creature of government. It surveilled my father-in-law, Reverend James Broom. She produced the film Trapped, Gideon's Army, focusing on the work of public interest lawyers. And of course, Rise, The Promise of My Brother's Keeper, the Netflix 4-part series on Bobby Kennedy. She's a lawyer, an artist, and truly a craftsperson of film. So we're just very fortunate to have her. Now, one of the conveners of this wonderful program, Hassani Prats, reached out to her mother-in-law. And colleagues, I want you all to know this. Sometimes this Harvard connection is really strange, right? Like you just sweep in people who don't know they're going to be caught up in this experience. But Mrs. Elmyra Gray Powell, who was a member of SNCC, who marched and demonstrated with John Lewis, and has her own testament and testimony, if you will, in terms of the civil rights movement and sacrifice. And who is, let me note this, as somebody who came up after the civil rights movement, we have a heroine in our midst, and we give her honor. I'm a creature of the Black church, and we got to tip our hat to our people. She is a retired attorney, former Cook County Assistant State Attorney. She is the youthful mother of 6 children, 14 grandchildren, 8, and this is a testament to Black not cracking, 8 great grandchildren. Just note for the record, it's all in the bio, people. She was, as I mentioned, a member of SNCC, having marched with John Lewis back in Nashville in 1961. She participated in a great number of civil rights marches and sit-ins. She may be seen in the documentary Eyes on the Prize, just a wonderful film, Good Trouble. She's mentioned in John Lewis's memoir, Walking with the Wind, a memoir of the movement. So colleagues, classmates, and students, activists, advocates, you are in for a wonderful discussion. So I just want to begin with a straightforward question, which is, would you share with us how you first met John Lewis and what that experience was like. And I'll just turn first to Mrs. Powell. I can just turn to you first.
Well, first of all, thank you all for including me among my youthful, learned colleagues who are carrying the torch forward as I am fading into the sunset. I first met John Lewis when we were forming SNCC in Nashville, Tennessee. Actually, SNCC had been formed the year before I went, but I was there in the school year 1960 to 61. And there had been demonstrations done by SNCC the previous year. And so it was already established in Nashville. I met John because he was a fellow soldier. We didn't have officers in SNCC. We had volunteers and participants. We had a president in Diane Nash. But
oh my gosh, yeah.
Other than that, there was a leveling of roles. James Bevel, there are others who continued in the movement long after our beginning in Nashville. But that's where I met John as being a fellow soldier in Nashville. He was a student at the Baptist Theological Seminary. And also Bernard Lafayette was one of his best friends. They might have been roommates, I'm not sure. But my impression of John when we first met him was that he wanted to be a preacher, and he was, as I say, in the theological school. But John had such a speech impediment that we did not feel that he had much of a future in anything that involved public speaking.
Wow.
However, John did not allow that to hold him back at all. But while we were in the movement, we were divided into teams, and the teams would go to different places, to different restaurants or the bus station. And the teams would be, I would say, 6 to 10 people. And we'd catch the proprietors by surprise. They did not know that they were going to have people coming in to sit in. And this was to break the barrier of segregation in public services at that time. And so even though our president was Diane Nash, a woman, there was still a hierarchy of men and women. Not so much in what we did, but the men, I would say, took it upon themselves to try to be very protective of us. And we didn't have cell phones and things like that to keep in instant communications. But when females would be, say, for example, trapped in a store, locked in by the proprietors, suddenly we would see through the window that John and James Bevel and others in the movement would be outside trying to get us out. Because when we would be locked in, many times they would start spraying insect poison and throwing cleanser all over us and spraying water. And they would say, oh, it's time to clean the restaurant. They would bring in a hose and start spraying water all over the place as if we thought that's the way you clean a restaurant. So often I would see them through the windows trying to get in to rescue us who were already locked in. But John impressed me. The biggest impression I had of John was that he was extremely grounded in nonviolence, in a religious path of Christianity, Christian nonviolence. Many people in civil rights movement were there for all kinds of reasons. Some were just there for the civil rights. some were not committed to nonviolence at all, except for the times that they were present in the movement. They say, okay, I can do it for a while I'm there, but I'm not committed to nonviolence. John was committed religiously to the path of nonviolence.
Wow.
And I knew I was in the presence of a heavyweight. I did not know what he would become, but I knew he had a calling far beyond what most of us students had at that time.
That's so powerful and such a vivid picture of the movement and you know, in the present moment, we talk about Black Lives Matter as being leaderful, flat hierarchy, a flat leadership model. But it's just powerful to hear you say that SNCC in that moment was flat, and that you have a woman president and men being servant leaders in terms of being protective. Just very powerful and very, very vivid. I think I want to turn to Michael, because you had a chance to work with Congressman Lewis for so many years, and Ms. Powell described him as a new activist. If you can just talk with him about your first impressions of him as a legislator. Michael, you may be on mute. You have a beautiful background, but you may be on mute. Okay, we hear you fine.
I had to move. I apologize.
No wonder. Your baritone is coming through.
Okay. What I will say is that my experience and opportunity to connect with the congressman first was in Morehouse. And so, I from Boston traveled down to Atlanta to go to school, and had this wonderful opportunity to be exposed to speakers from all around the world. And they brought them in as freshmen, as we were freshmen. And so I met the congressman just when he came to speak to the freshman class. And as all the speakers do, they avail themselves and offer the opportunity that once they leave, to keep in touch with them. And I, again, coming from Boston, and I hate to say, apologize, didn't know very much about my history and the civil rights movement, and still when he came, I didn't know who he was, honestly. But he was such a powerful figure. And it's funny how, others have talked about, the congressman and his speaking, and have talked about the fact that of his list, but he came across so powerful, in speaking to the freshman class, that I was like, wow, who is that? And everybody said, well, he's the congressman from this district with Morehouse then. And, that was just the first moment that I had of him. And I didn't reconnect with him until several years later when I was ready to graduate from college. And he had, again, the wonderful gift of always giving. And I had asked for a letter of recommendation to go work after college. And he gave me a pen, a congressional pen, and a letter of recommendation for a job that I didn't get. But I moved back to Boston, and wow. several years later had an opportunity to reconnect with him. But he was just always a giving individual. He was just somebody who he had a heart of gold, and he just wanted to always give. And I was just one. As I found, after working for 21 years, that he wanted to extend that to everybody that he met. He just had that spirit, and he expected all of us that work with him to do the very same thing as an extension of who he was. And so, when other students would write, and ask for letters of recommendation, and we didn't know them, we had no idea who they were. But for him, again, it was the spirit. And it was the asking, and he felt strongly about it that was what we did, and so I benefited from that opportunity as well. But that's my early beginning of knowing the congressman.
Now that's an amazing story, that a congressman that you meet as a freshman, whose name you don't know, a few years later you ask him for a letter of recommendation. I mean, this kind of reminds me of story of John Lewis writing to Martin Luther King as a high schooler, right? and
exactly
asking to meet him, right? So,
Exactly.
you know, in both instances, I guess a generation apart, you had some holy boldness, as did he, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And others did, you know, and so that's why it was important for us to honor that, you know, and even now when I think about it so many years later and have thought about all the opportunities that he afforded others, that was the spirit in which he was able to just keep giving of himself. You know, writing that letter was so important. That writing that letter to Dr. King was so important. It lasted throughout his whole life, the impression of it, and even the response from Dr. King, you know. And so in everything that he did, that we did, all of that manifested itself in just those moments, in that action. I mean, there was no time that he did not want us to write letters. in the world of digital, the world of emails, he wanted us to write letters. He didn't understand that we didn't have to write letters anymore, that we had emails now, but he wanted a handwritten letter given to constituents, you know, because of that very nature. And so it was a constant battle, just in correspondence. Signatures were very important to him. Signatures were important to him. He collected signatures of everybody, you know, and again, it just speaks to the character and the man who he is.
Wow. Phenomenal. You know, Don, let me just say, as a connoisseur of film, it's my understanding that, you know, films kind of come into being as a consequence of visual and auditory impressions. So I'm just curious, when did you meet John Lewis, and what was that experience like?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for convening us all. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Don.
Hi, Ms. Powell. Nice to meet you. So the first time I met, you know, I mean, I knew about the congressman from school and, you know, just from history. But the first time I met him, he agreed to speak to a group of public defenders in my first film, Gideon's Army. And everyone was very excited. So we had a couple of the kids come up, and he addressed it was like a fundraiser for from indigent defense lawyers, for lawyers who represent the poor. And he addressed the group, and he was so passionate, and he pointed out to them, you know, speaking of, you know, Michael's and Ms. Powell both spoken about how generous he was. He made it a point to connect his advocacy and success in the movement for civil rights with their work, and to impress upon them how important it was. He said, I'll just never forget, he said, if it wasn't for the lawyers, I don't know where we would be. And he told stories about people getting them out of jail. You know, they intentionally chose to go to jail. Like you see that in the film, John Lewis, Good Trouble, about how when the student activists were given the choice, they went to jail. They went to jail to make that point. And it's one of my favorite parts of the film where, you know, the narrator from some historical footage says, you know, they could have gotten a fine and gone home. And that's not what they were about. They were about staying together and making that larger point. Such a powerful, you know, point it was. So that was the first time I met Mr. Lewis. And then the second time, he gave us an interview in the series Bobby Kennedy for President. And what I didn't know about him was that he had been an aide to then Senator Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, but that also on the day that Dr. King was murdered, Mr. Lewis was working for Kennedy and had organized that rally that Kennedy was supposed to speak at that night. And Kennedy's other white aides were saying, you can't speak, it's going to be a riot, it's too dangerous.
Right, wow.
And a 20-something-year-old John Lewis said, you must speak to them tonight. You have to speak to them. And Indianapolis was one of the only cities that did not have rioting that night. And it is one of the, if not the only time that Senator Kennedy referred to the bitterness and anger in his heart over his brother's killing at the hands of a white man. And that's how he said it. He said, my brother was killed by a white man. And so I understand your anger. It's a very, very powerful moment in history. And there's John Lewis again, you know, the youngest aide. And that's who Kennedy chose to listen to. And they had a very remarkable, close friendship, of, you know, mutual respect. So then when I was approached by CNN to do this film, I just thought, I had never heard that Bobby Kennedy story. There were so many more stories about Mr. Lewis to tell. So it was really, you know, honor and a pleasure to spend some time with him in what we didn't realize would be the last, you know, years of his life.
You know, the measure of a wonderful panel are the number of moments where people say, I didn't know that. I wish I knew that. It means a lot for me to know that. And just in these few moments, I'm hearing and sensing so many of those moments. Ms. Powell, you know, one of the things I'm curious about is, you knew John Lewis at the beginning, you know, in terms of his ascendancy as a leader. What did you see in, or what do you see in John Lewis, this beloved elder statesman, compared to John Lewis, this young emerging leader, right? You know, so like when I talk to my students, I said, well, you know, you think of John Lewis as the elder statesman, not like a high schooler trying to grapple with, you know, his own, you know, moral calling and moral ambitions and call to leadership. I think generationally speaking, notwithstanding how youthful looking you are, but I think you may be the most qualified to speak to this subject.
What was clear in our group was that there were people who, as I mentioned before, people who agreed to be nonviolent just for the protest. And
Right.
then after that, they were done with it. John, you could tell just by being around him, there was a gravitas to him. I did not have any idea that he would have become a politician. I would have thought he would have remained outside the political system as a moral leader, somewhat in the manner of Dr. King. Because I don't know really how to express this accurately, except to say, if you've ever been around a person who you can viscerally know is a weighty presence. I'm sorry that I met one of the popes once, and he was not one of my favorite popes politically. He was more one of the conservative popes. But I'm telling you, when he reached out and he shook my hand, I knew I was in the presence of someone who had gravitas, meaning a grounding and at the same time a high calling. And I knew that when I was around John Lewis. I didn't know where he was going to end up, but I knew that he had that internal strength and groundedness, and at the same time a vision of accomplishment and high heights.
You know, so Ms. Powell, when I hear you say that, you know, I wouldn't imagine that's a matter of stature. You know, he wasn't particularly tall, right? And became a powerful orator, but was not at that moment.
That's correct.
I would imagine that has something to do with his spirit, his faith, his convictions. Yeah. And you physically sense that?
Yes, I could physically sense that. I wish I could tell you how one senses that. It has to happen to you when you leave that person's presence, or when you come into that person's presence. You know you're with someone who is, as I would say, morally and spiritually grounded, but at the same time has a vision way beyond where we are, and a calling, if you will.
When did you, I'm just curious about that. When did you get a sense of his vision? I mean, you know, he spoke at the March on Washington. He bodily, you know, put himself on the line. There was certain eloquence of example, like, you know, he set a good example. But that vision, when did you get a sense of that?
It wasn't so much a precise vision, but his commitment to the spiritual aspects of nonviolence. You go back to Gandhi,
That's
and
right.
then, of course, Martin Luther King. For them, it was a spiritual calling and a long-term commitment. It wasn't just we're here for this particular incident, or we're here for this year. I could tell that he had made a lifetime commitment to the struggle in whatever form it took.
So powerful. So Michael, I have maybe a related question. Since you met Congressman Lewis as a congressman, as a legislator, if you could speak about his legislative legacy, right? Since you spent so much time with him, and relate that to him as an activist. In other words, many of us know him as a heroic activist figure, but he was a legislator for a long time.
Yeah, he really was. Ms. Powell speaks to this gravitas. And it's really interesting because one of the things that over the time I've really thought more about this, and unfortunately had an opportunity to go back home. The congressman's youngest sister passed away a few weeks ago. And so I was home down in Troy, Alabama. And I was on the land that he grew up on. And I've said this before, but I had to, say it again to his brothers and sisters, just the way that I've seen it. And what I can say is that gravitas is the early beginnings of John Lewis. It is that rich family. He talked about them every day, every opportunity he could invoke his mother and his father, his brothers and sisters, and how rich that feeling in that time in his life.
Share a little bit about that, because I think a lot of people want to know more about like where he came from, familiarly speaking.
Yeah, I mean, he came from Troy, Alabama, and Carter's Quarters. And, again, just a rich family upbringing. They didn't have a lot. They had a farm, and they were his father was sharecroppers, and everybody worked in that farm, but they were so close. But the part and the answer to your question is deeply rooted in this. His faith carried him. And he talked about how his faith carried him through so many times in his life, but his political career was an extension of his faith. And so, the decisions that he made, the opportunities he had to embark on, it wasn't a vision, it was the spirit that was within him. And so, Mrs. Lewis used to talk about him as being prophet-like. And Ms. Powell talks about it as well, that there was just spirit, there was just anointing of the congressman, that he walked around as a common man, but just possessed such a spirit. And, it was what was right. He would say it. It was what was right. It was what was fair. And those weren't just words. Yeah. Again, those were extensions of his teachings, from early years of his family and their belief and going to church. And so that's what we witnessed. That's the life that we witnessed of him and the calling of his life. And I was reminded of that when I stepped foot on that farm a couple of weeks ago. And just remembered how he loved his family so much and how much they meant to him and how rich that upbringing was. And I used to say it all the time. John Lewis, the statesman, the American hero, is not too far from that little boy, Troy, in Troy, Alabama. Honestly, I tell you. And, when I've had an opportunity to talk a little bit more over the past few weeks and months, and I challenge young people to just hold true to your to those early years, your family, keep them close and just, the values that you learn, you learn from at that time, just keep them close and remember them and carry them through your life. Don't forget about them. That's what John Lewis did. He never forgot. He never forgot where he came from. He never forgot the people he met along the way, and those are just important, but it wasn't something he had to keep at. It was just who he was. And so we can all try to be like John Lewis. But we can definitely learn from just some of the lessons that he taught us, or that he showed us. More importantly, that was what was real.
Wow. Wow. I like what you ended with, is that is what was real, right? Real as in authentic and enduring. Like, this is not transitory, temporary, a fad, but who he was from back in the day to the end of his life.
And the beautiful part about it is, Don and other opportunities, to capture him, but Don did it so beautifully. Just John Lewis, you got the John Lewis, and that's what people, I wish could have an opportunity to have had what I had for 21 years, but have the opportunity to learn, because there's so many wonderful, rich lessons. And so, yeah.
Wow. So, Don, you worked on so many different films. What was it about Good Trouble that was special, like unlike, unique, distinctive, relative to anything else you've done? And what did you learn about John Lewis that was the most surprising?
Ooh, I mean, when you read about great people, it's hard to remember that they are people. Yeah. And so what Michael and what Ms. Powell are saying is really important, that the congressman was the calmest person I have ever met. Just preternaturally calm in the middle of storms, which doesn't mean he wasn't passionate and impressive and large, but he was just always calm. And I think a couple of things listening to this conversation, and we had the benefit of going through like many tens and almost probably 100 hours of archival footage, because he's been so photographed, and we studied his speeches. And the thing that's, I think, really important to understand about the congressman is nonviolence is not turning the other cheek. That's a misunderstanding of what it is. It is an active acceptance that I will not allow violence, which is a sin against God. I will not allow that. I will not become the person who seeks to make me his enemy. Right. And that's important, because John Lewis wasn't looking for enemies. Others were seeking to make him an enemy, and to resist that, the tool of nonviolence was the resistance to that. I will not let you take my humanity from me, my effort to imitate God, to be godly. And that's really important to understand, because nonviolence is hard. It's much easier it's not a tactic. Right. He was baptized in it by Reverend Lawson, by studying Gandhi, by studying South African, movements, by studying the movements that included violence as an option and rejecting it. So I think I really think of it as like, you're baptized when you're a baby, and that's not your choice. But when you're an adult and you go back to the church and you understand what it means to make that commitment to God and to a religious life, I feel like that's what the acceptance of nonviolence was for him. And so once you understand that about him, there was no other way. He didn't see any other way to be other than. So I think the other thing that's important to understand is he would say, keep your eyes on the prize so often that it became kind of smoothed over, worn down. But that was his rallying cry, this is not these particular troubles in front of us. That's not the struggle. The struggle is out there. It's equality. It's accepting all humans for who they are. So, one of the things, I really like during the making of the movie, I would say to him Mr. Lewis, I'm so worried about children in cages, or, any number of things that the former president was doing. And he would just start talking about he wouldn't necessarily, he would shake his head and say, yes, that's, but he would start talking about like what you could do. And he could just figure out a way to turn the conversation to what you could do instead of allowing you to swim in what seems so big. And my husband, I don't know if I told you this, Michael, but my husband started calling him my life coach. Because at some point I was like, well, if John Lewis is not upset, who am I to be depressed and defeated and angry and bitter? Because he was like, if you let people make you bitter, that's why he would say, don't be bitter or hostile. That's robbing you of your humanity. And I'm just like, if people would just really listen to what he was saying, they would know all about who he was. But I think the thing that was really surprising was just how funny the congressman was. Really great sense of humor. I really love seeing his relationship with his staff. He really was very proud of Michael's accomplishments. Tisa's husband, David, was on his district staff, Rachel O'Neill. He just was very proud of his little family.
Wow.
And that's, so many of them were with him for so long. And then, a lot of people don't know this, but I mean, Michael really cared for him in his last days, not as a staffer, but really cared for him.
Wow.
And you don't get that kind of relationship often or easily. But I love watching them tease each other. Remember when you said, Michael, are you more baptized than me? And he said, yes. You are not as baptized as I am because we go under the water. Michael's like, he's like, you just get the sprinkle. That's not baptism.
So wait a minute. So Michael, you're Methodist?
AME. Yes.
Oh, you're AME. Okay, you like I am. We just get a little water.
Right. Too. We just get a little sprinkle. And so Michael said, I got the sprinkle. He said, you're more baptized than me? And he said, yes, I am.
Wow.
Yeah.
So for our non-Christian colleagues out there, in terms of the rituals of Christianity, some of us put a little water to baptize, and the Baptists, of which John Lewis was one, they go under the water, right? And now, of course, those of us Methodists don't think that makes you any better or any more likely to go to heaven, but we could be mistaken. So, one point I really appreciate you lifting up, Don, was, his hopefulness, right? So when you talk to many of the youngest activists in this moment, you hear 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds who say that they are in fact burnt out. So last summer, right, the George Floyd protests, 26 million Americans who took to the streets. And I've heard many, many times, many young people say they feel burnt out. How do you have hope? If I could just ask each of you to just speak to the hope of John Lewis, just real quickly, that'd be great.
Well, I would just like to say, with John, I felt there was a lifetime commitment. It wasn't like, I look at the civil rights movement now, I think it is incident driven. What has happened, and let us go and do something about that. Back in my time, we were the driving of the incidents. We said, over here, we're going to have a demonstration, or over here, we're going to protest this, or we're going, the strategy was made by us. We were not responding to the incidents. And John his whole life was committed to driving forth an agenda of love, nonviolence, and fairness. And you could just feel it in him. And I knew that's what was going to be his life. I just didn't know in what way he would, act it out.
So Ms. Powell, you should really be on the Kennedy School faculty, because the distinction you made between incident-driven leadership and proactive leadership, and that the virtues of love and non-violence being drivers, right? Critically important because so many of our leaders, youngest leaders, grappling with this notion of how do we give people a sense of hope? How do we have a sense of hope as leaders ourselves? So, I'm on the appointments committee. I don't have much power, but I think I need to make a recommendation. We need a shakeup here. Michael Hope, Michael Don, can you all speak to the hope of John Lewis?
Yeah, I mean, the congressman would say this, and Ms. Powell is correct in saying that it was a life calling for him. But he would say, Don, remember this, he would say he would have an executive session with himself.
With himself.
And he would say, self, this is what you're going to do. Self, this is what's going to happen. Wow. And he told the story. He said he had an executive session with himself. And he said he adopted the discipline of nonviolence as a way of life. And he lived that. He made a conscious decision to do that. And so Mrs. Powell is correct in that this was his calling. This is a decision that he made for his life, and that he was going to be optimistic. And to Don's point, he was always going to look to the bright side of things, to the moving forward type of things. He would never get lost for long. We had elections that came and went, and he was so passionate about politics and elections, and he would go down when we lost. I literally would have to pick him up off the floor just because he was so down. But he woke up the next morning and he looked at the possibilities of what we could do now. But that's just who he was.
So all those in attendance, this is the point where in a lecture I would say, please tap on your laptop, write that down, an executive session with yourself. Write that, take note to self. Dawn.
One of the sequences we created in the film John Lewis Good Trouble was a sequence about his legislative accomplishments, which you were speaking with Michael about earlier. And so, he was in Congress a long time. So we went through and said, all right, how many bills was he a sponsor or a co-sponsor? Because he voted for, constantly. And we found so many that we had to narrow them down. We couldn't fit them all in the scroll. But when you see a pattern to that legislation, you see a consistent pattern of showing up for rights, for LGBTQ rights, for women's rights, for all minorities, just over voting, just over and over and over. You see a moral path to the legislation that he would affix his name to. And he was just always showing up. So that's one thing that I think he really, did believe in government and did believe that the government should, take care of those who need some help. And he believed everybody needs some help. The other thing I remember is that, when he got into Congress, he met with the squad. And he was really uniquely in a position to talk about the turn from activist to legislator.
That's right.
And I think about that a lot because I think of how missed his voice is when we're trying to, he never lost sight of what his position in the ecosystem was. There was a reason why Nancy Pelosi would call him the conscience of the Congress, is he could be that conscience, but he could also cross the aisle. He could work with people who were unlikely allies. And I think if he was setting that example today, we might have another path for some bipartisan activity, but I do think that all of that does come back to an optimism about life and about human capacity for empathy and understanding. And then, the last thing I'll say about that is Michael, when we were on that pilgrimage and we were filming and we went to Bryan Stevenson's Civil Rights Museum, and Mr. Lewis you walk in and there's an exhibit about him. So we're in there and he's watching an exhibit about himself at, 19 or 20 in Nashville. And he's watching the footage and he says, sometimes I can't believe that's me. And he starts talking about that day to, it was like a kid next to him. Can you imagine being in the Civil Rights Museum and John Lewis is explaining what was happening that day to you in person? I mean, the kid was like, what is happening here? But it gave me the idea that, oh, he needs to see us the way we see him, because he didn't dwell on how other people saw him. That's another part of being peaceful, is if you don't care what other people think, you're not all worried about a lot of things that a lot of us worry about. It frees up a lot of emotional energy if you really don't care. You just keep your eyes on the prize. You keep your eyes on your goal and not looking around to distracting things. So we set up these 3 screens in a theater in Washington, D.C., and we made several movies, all archival of sequences of his life, and showed them to him, and then put him in the middle of a stage quiet. Because the other thing we couldn't film in his office, because if a constituent came or somebody came in, he would be like, excuse me, I got to get up. Or if we were in his house, he was like, my house is so junky. My mother would be embarrassed. So I had to pull him out of, his normal places, or he would be distracted because he was always doing multiple things, at once. So putting him in this quiet space where he could see himself, I was trying to replicate that museum experience.
Wow.
And then I just was like, tell me about that day. And then he would, he really, so I really feel like so happy that we did that, because I just made that up. Like, I didn't know if I was going to work or not. But what it did is, I think, I hope, or I really think that it allowed him to see himself and what he accomplished the way that all of us see him, And so it was a really, like, when you say, like, what's a special memory, that is among the most.
It's such a, there's so many leadership lessons here, namely the through line in his legislative record, like being concerned about rights. Him being in a theater with a child and explaining himself to a child, there's a humility there, right? And your point, Dawn, about the lack of care about how you're viewed, there's a humility there, but also a perspective and a moral prioritization. In other words, others and the world being more important. So I want to just turn to a few questions from the audience. And I see Asani with her hand up. If you could just raise your hand really quickly, we'll try to get a few questions in. And I know that Michael is off to serve the nation. Okay, good. Asani, please.
Michael, I would like for you to, if you could, like, what is the one thing you want? There are a lot of young people on this, and this is also going to be, it's also recorded and will also be on the policy, Anti-Racism Policy Journal website.
Right.
And I would love for you to share with the people who will view this later, and some of them are my nieces and nephews who are on this call, what would be something memorable that you want them to know about John Lewis as it relates to how they can do, how they can be a leader and how they can be a keeper of his legacy.
Yeah, I think I would say, the thing about the congressman that I think everybody should try to adopt, and that is respecting the dignity and worth of every individual, of every human being, not taking anyone for granted, and meeting people where they are. And that's what he did his whole entire life. And he respected people beyond measure, he did. He would come up, he came up with this thing probably about 10 years ago. And it was kind of awkward. I didn't understand it for a long time. He would constantly say over and over again to his colleagues, be a little bit more human. And I was like, what is that about? Why does he keep saying that? Be a little bit more human. We just need to be more human. And I was like, what does that mean, be more human? And he just adopted it in a saying to his colleagues on the floor in caucus meetings. And for me, as I understood it really simply, it just, he would continue to say, we've got to recognize people. when we see people in the streets, when we see people in any way, we just got to acknowledge them. Hi, how are you? You know, he would constantly go through the halls of Congress and say, hey, hi, my brother. Hi, my sister. You know, he would never miss an opportunity to stop and acknowledge the police officers, all of the workers in the superintendent's office. I mean, we were never on time for a meeting. We were never on time for anything because he respected the dignity of worth of everybody. And that's a lesson I think the world is changing and it's a different place, you know, even since he's passed. And I think we just, you know, really need to think about who's around us and the differences that we see, and we've got to respect them and understand them, you know. Right. So I would echo that. That's what I would share.
Yeah. Ms. Powell, you moved in your chair like it was something on the tip of your tongue.
Well, one of the questions that I was thinking about was someone asked who's going to be the next John Lewis. And what I was going to say is the thing about John is that no one would have predicted that he would be the John Lewis that he was. So this is why we have to have childcare. We have to have excellent schools. We have to have opportunities for everyone to get higher education, because we don't know where the next John Lewis is coming from. We don't know if the John Lewis is going to come from the projects of one of the big cities or the farms or the Midwest. We don't know. And so this is why it's so important that everyone get an opportunity for education and political education as well.
Wow.
You know, something that makes me think of, both your comments together, is I think people constantly underestimated Mr. Lewis because he was small and because he had that little bit of speech situation happening when he was younger. And as much as he is admired, I think he is somewhat misunderstood. What John Lewis was a brilliant strategist, a brilliant political strategist. And while he is admired, and as he should be, for his moral compass and his faith and adherence to a moral perspective in public life, he also was able to figure out, and he, you know, people described to me that he was always pushed forward. He was not the loudest voice in the room, but people rallied around him. They wanted to hear what he would say, and he'd speak really quietly, but they wanted to hear what he would say. And so he emerged as a leader. I wouldn't quite say a reluctant leader, but not a leader who was seeking a spotlight. He just could lead. He could lead. And he was so consistent, he was always going to show up. So I really take your point, Ms. Powell, about we don't know who the quiet thinker is, who may not be screaming for attention, but who can see the whole field and see how to get from A to B. And, you know, some of the lessons that he showed people, we see them in so many countries today. We see, you know, and I will also say, it was so gratifying to know that he saw, in the wake of George Floyd's death, he saw people, and he said this, in every state and around the world, coming together and taking to the streets. And Michael did something that really was a huge gift. Do you want to tell them about taking him to the Black Lives Matter, you know, art installation in DC when he was very ill and he wanted to go?
Yeah, he was insistent. As sick as he was, he you know, was watching TV and he saw the unveiling of the plaza, and you know, he said, I want to go see that. And for me, I was more concerned about his care, and that was the last thing I was thinking about. But he said it again, and I said, yeah, I'll get you there. Thinking I was gonna, on the way to chemotherapy, you know, take him and just, you know, drive by. And then I had a moment and I thought, Michael, you got to do something. You got to really get this happening. You got to make this work. And so, again, I don't know why I second guessed myself or thought about it again, but I then made a few calls I said to the congressman, I said, I got a surprise for you. He said, what? I said, I'm going to take you to Black Lives Matter Plaza. And he said, really? I said, yeah. I said, but the only thing is, unfortunately, I can't take you in the crowd. I've got to get you there early in the morning. So we've got to get up at 4 a.m. He looked at me like, okay, if you do it, we'll do it. And so we got together, and I got to the house at 4 a.m. and got dressed, and we were in the car, and we were at Black Lives Matter at 6 a.m. in the morning. We took to the top of the building overlooking, and he just, it was everything that he wanted to see, and it meant so much to him. To John's point, Congressman was very ill, and he laid in bed watching the news. He watched the footage, and it was very, very difficult. It was impossible for him to not be able to do anything. I took him to Atlanta. He wanted to go home. I walked into the room, and he was crying. And I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, he just shrugged his shoulders. I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "It's too much." He said, "It's too much." And and this is as the news was going on. And I said, "Well, I know this is difficult and you haven't had a chance to speak." I said, "Do you want to speak? There's over 100 requests here for you to speak on what is going on." And he shook his head. He just said no. He just shook his head no. But I think the moment that he had to stand on that plaza was a full circle moment for him, and it was a connection to what he had witnessed, to the work that he had done, to his life. And, life is amazing. We had no idea that was his last public appearance. That was absolutely his last public appearance. And we had no idea that, just shy of a month from that moment, he was not with us.
Yeah.
And, we're just so grateful, for his spirit that touched me and touched others, touched the nation. And, he led us, and he still continues to lead us, and we're just so grateful for it.
So Michael, I want to honor and invoke that image. Is a strangely enough, oddly enough, a benedictory note for this conversation. Meaning, that image of John Lewis standing in Black Lives Matter Plaza with stage 4 cancer, leaning on a cane. That picture was as eloquent an epistle to the next generation as anything that could be said from a microphone, on a pulpit, on a podium, because it literally said that he is with us, right? And so much so that when I saw that picture, the next class, the next semester, we put that picture on the syllabus to say, this is what we're teaching. This is the legacy we're teaching. And so, with that said, I'd like to just ask each of you, as you recall, John Lewis wrote an epistle to the next generation of activists, advocates, leaders, published posthumously in the New York Times. You all worked with him, you marched with him, demonstrated with him, served with him. What do you think his words would be for the people on this Zoom call and in this meeting, and to this generation of leaders at the Kennedy School and elsewhere? What would his words be to them in this moment?
Can I just say that that letter, those were his words. So I would first just encourage everybody to read that letter, because those were his words. And if I can just share with you that I had the opportunity to read it back to him and to get his approval. Okay. And he said yes. So, I don't want to try to recreate what the words could be, because he said it, and we were intentional about making sure that we put that out there.
Yeah.
The only other thing that I would just say, and again, these are his words, is to just carry on, literally to carry on. And, he understood what was in front of him. He understood what was in front of us. He understood what was in front of the nation and the people. And, he was so astute and understood. And, I've had a difficult time to learn how to carry on, but we all have to carry on and do the work, the extension of his work, and there's so much work to do. I mean, he would say this. I feel crazy because I'm still saying the words that he would say exactly verbatim, but it's true. It's absolutely true. And we have, such a unique opportunity in the life of John Lewis to just carry on, the many lessons. And they're there. We don't need to recreate them. I don't want to, create any other words other than his, because they're powerful and exist still.
Michael has, he's leaving out a very important part of that story, which is that you had the presence of mind to say, we have to photograph this moment. If I'm going to get this 84-year-old man on fourth stage 4 cancer, and he was so particular about his clothes. So you should know this, which would mean like Michael would have to put his favorite clothes on and his like that nice sweater, and he was sensitive about his appearance, and Michael would have to do all of that. But in doing all of that, and if you've cared for anyone, you know what it's like. You're completely consumed with their safety.
Yeah.
Michael said, because you called me, remember? And you said, I have 3 photographers. And he was thinking about that moment, that it was going to be a moment. And I think, I would remember at that time, I would be at the thing, John Lewis would get the question all the time, how do you feel about Black Lives Matter? How do you feel about Black Lives Matter? And I think it was like somewhat mystifying to him. He was like, what do you mean? A movement for Black lives? I'm for that. Because people misunderstood and think that Black Lives Matter was violent. And so they wanted to pit them movements against each other, a classic divide and conquer tactic. And he refused to be drawn into it. So in doing that, Michael literally fulfilled his last wish. But he also, you gave us this gift of that is his mic drop answer to how do I feel about Black Lives Matter? This is how I feel. I got up out of my deathbed to pay homage to this art installation and to say I will always be with my people. So I would say, like, Michael can probably recite this with me. We know what he would say. He'd say, keep your eyes on the prize. Don't be bitter or hostile.
Yep. Don't give up. Don't give out.
Don't give up. Don't give in.
Thank you.
And we're laughing because he would say it all the time, but he really meant it.
He did. He really did. And he didn't. I mean, he didn't give out. He didn't give in. He didn't.
Don't be bitter or hostile.
Yeah. So, Ms. Powell?
Yes. In a way, I am reminded of one of our earlier Black congressmen who would just say, keep the faith, baby. And I think that is what John never lost faith. He never lost faith, no matter whatever disappointment, whatever stumble, whatever loss there was. He kept his eye on the agenda of equality, fairness, and justice. And he never lost sight of it.
Yes. Wow. Let me, I'm going to close this session and turn it over to Asani Prats and Tisa Smart Washington as representatives of the Anti-Racism Journal here at the Kennedy School. But let me do so with words of appreciation to our panel. And I want to thank you not merely for speaking powerfully, candidly, forthrightly about the legacy of John Lewis, but let me thank you for your obvious love and dedication and commitment to his memory. And Michael, none of us knew or I should say, many of us did not know all that went into what Don described as that moment. And the personal commitment that each of you have made to his legacy. It comes from the heart. And anybody listening to this conversation, I've had many, panel discussions at the Kennedy School. This has been brilliant intellectually, yes, leadership, yes, but it's been brilliant as in illuminating, right, from the heart. And so I just want to thank you as a servant leader, a student of John Lewis, for your contributions to this conversation. And we want to thank the Center for Public Leadership, certainly thank the Anti-Racism Journal, Bo Wages, all of the students, everyone who is in this moment with us, and everyone who made this possible, certainly Kevin Maloney and my staff, and to all of you. So with that said, I want to turn it over to our leaders. And again, thank you, because in partaking in this conversation, the words are not only spoken, the words are heard, and the words are reflected in our deeds. And because I'm a minister, I've always been taught, as a matter of Judaism, Jewish theology, that when you speak a name, you invoke a presence. So for us to say John Lewis, we're not merely lifting up a name, we're invoking a presence. And so I just end with those words, Congressman John Lewis. With that said, I just turn it over to our host.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the leadership committee, the leadership team on the Anti-Racism Policy Journal, myself, Tiza, and Thomas Bishop, and Casey Short, we are so delighted, Professor Brooks, that you answered the call when we called and asked you if you could do this. My mother-in-law, Elmyra, mom, thank you so much. And Michael, thank you for taking care of our beloved and for always making the time whenever we call and we use the name, our honorable John Lewis. You walked away from the White House right now to make sure that this happens. So we really appreciate you and your dedication.
You could tell.
And to my friend Don Porter, thank you very, very much for chronicling and archiving for us our legend, our hero. And without what you did and your vision for how to portray our beloved, generations from now will be able to see who the man was and what he stood for and how we need to follow in his footsteps. And he followed in the footsteps of Jesus, and those of us who were of the Christian faith really appreciate how you made sure that was caught on film, and really thankful to you for that. I'm going to turn it over to my girl here, whose husband worked for John Lewis, who you knew for many, many decades. He's been in John Lewis's home. And so this was very personal to both of us. We wanted to make sure that the congressman was commemorated here and his legacy was enshrined here at the Kennedy School. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike.
Thank you. And Michael did mention that the congressman's words were his words. So I think that's an appropriate way for us to close out this session. So in his final editorial, at the end, he said, when historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you, CPL staff. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
There's Casey. Where's Bishop?
He's on here somewhere.
Okay.